All right, you happily miserable accursed. Welcome back to Curse of Politics. Hey, Jenny. Hey, Scott.
Hey.
You know what? You know what's great about this show? It's that we're not known for prevaricating or shying away from exactly what's on our goddamn minds. And so right off the top here, we have an announcement to make. Jenny is going to be taking a little break from the pod.
Ooh.
Let's call it a Jenni Byrne prorogation of the Curse of Politics. I want to be clear, the pod will go on. This is not a dissolution of the show. There's a good reason why Jenny's taking a break. Jenny, why don't you talk to the accursed?
Well, listen, one of the great things that I love about doing the pod with you guys is we are like totally upfront. We are totally honest in terms of our background and working in politics. And so for the first time in a while, I'm actually back working on a campaign. And so just like I was, I've been very open about is I'm going to be helping Pierre on his campaign. And I think it's unfair to a whole host of people, our listeners, to you guys, to him, to people out there. If I stay on the pod and I'm more in a campaign mode than what I am in a Jenny mode, because I'm not going to be as kind of open and I'm probably not as open and to the point as what I normally am, because you guys have to understand, you guys have been there when we're officially on campaigns, things change in terms of public communications. And so it's not forever. It's just for the next few months. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to chat with you guys every Tuesday morning.
Man, I don't know. I knew Polyev would hurt me someday, but I didn't know he would hurt me like this.
Well, Jenny, it is. So the reason I think we can all safely say that each of us is 1/26 of the most powerful person in Canada, according to Maclean's magazine, plump, is that we're current.
We probably fall right out of the top 50 now, eh, Scott?
I think so, and that's what I was just going to say. I mean, obviously, the reality is we're supposed to be contemporary observers, but, you can't give me and David away. The big distinction is you're wanted. You're going to be helping to shape the next 5 years of Canadian politics. David and I can't even. They tried to give us to Goodwill, and Value Village sent us back with a note that said, we don't accept damaged properties. But, Jenny, I'm sorry that you're not going to be here, but I understand completely, and it's a testament to your talent, right? It's to, like, if I'm running a Conservative leadership, I want Jenni Byrne, and if Jenni Byrne's running the Conservative leadership, then I guess we can't have her here for a little bit.
Well, and that makes you what you are. You're a gamer, so
And it just shows. Sorry, Dave.
No, go ahead.
Well, it just shows you how much we love you. Right? Like the affection and admiration that we have for you, the fact that we can feel sad and that we love you so much, even though both I think David and I feel that you're about to embark on an enterprise that is terrifyingly awful and could destroy all the things and values that we believe in. But, when you're in love, don't sweat the small details. So, bon voyage and best of luck.
Well, I love you guys too, and I love everyone that listens, and I hope people aren't too disappointed. But this is a short time. It's not a long time.
So I want to underline something here. Jenny will be coming back to us, and she'll be coming back before the Conservative leadership race is over, probably, because later this spring, the Curse of Politics is going daily again for the Ontario election.
Woo!
And presents no problem for Jenny, and so she'll be back in the seat, and the three of us, you can look forward to the three of us starting in May, daily, talking to you about the Ontario election. So if you look forward to that, you can look forward to that.
Thank God for that, say people. 2 months of just Herle and Reid. It's going to smell like, this podcast is going to stink like ass crack and gummies. It's going to be pretty hard to get through.
All right, Jenny, go kick some ass, all right?
All right, bye, guys. Love you.
Yeah. I love you. Good luck.
You too.
Bye.
All right, Scott, Today we'll talk about peace, order, and good government.
Oh.
And the emergency measures it apparently takes to get those things back. We're going to talk about the protests and about how governments have handled the protests today. We'll do our cursed clipping. This week it's John Ivison from the National Post on the need for a new centrist party, and we'll end with our Hayus. So, Scott, what the fuck? What are we going to do here?
Well, if it weren't for the podcast, we would just smoke weed and drink rum and coke. And, so I don't know if that's going to intrigue people very much. But we have some experience just sitting around together over the last 35 years. Look, I think I'll say this about the Emergency Measures Act, and I'm interested to get your take on this because we've not talked about it. The more I thought about it yesterday, watching the announcement being made yesterday, watching the run-up to the announcement being made, people debating it, the more I thought two things. One, I think, and I lack the expertise, the policy expertise, obviously, to make this judgment, but I think my own little tiny brain, I've come to the conclusion that this must mostly be about the money. Because I'm sort of trying to understand, and I still don't, but what are the instruments of authority that were unavailable that could be deployed by the federal government without the Emergencies Act? And it seems to me like when we talk about, whatever, maybe military grade intelligence sharing, we talk about rapid deployment of, RCMP officers. We're not talking about the military. That's been obviously telegraphed and emphasized and underlined, not the War Measures Act, not rolling tanks in. So it just seems to me that I couldn't most of, if not all of those things have been utilized previously without the Emergencies Act. And I wonder, a supposition I have is that the real trigger for it is as people are sitting around on day 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and people of Ottawa are going, where the fuck is the government, any level of government, the local police force, the provincial government, the federal government, where in the hell are they? We can't move in our own city. We're under siege here. I wonder if the advice the Prime Minister was getting was, look, if you want to play some cards, choke off their fuel. And it ain't diesel, it's dollars. So choke it off. And in order to do that, we can go and ask the banks, but they're going to say no. They're going to say no. They're not going to treat some customers that way. They're not going to intervene in that fashion. So if you really want to target the money, you're going to have to take some of the authority that can only be granted via the Emergencies Act. And so I wonder if that's, in fact, what's behind it. The second thing I'll say, I'll stop real quick. What if it doesn't work? Althea Raj wrote a great piece in the Toronto Star today, and she asked this question. It's been on my mind implicitly and explicitly for 4 or 5 days because I started thinking about the Emergencies Act even before it was debated and imposed. And I'm sort of thinking, well, we say, oh, well, don't worry, we're not bringing in the military. But what if choking off their money doesn't have the immediate effect that we think? What if it isn't as consequential? What if 4 days from now, 5 days from now, 9 days from now, those guys are still in Ottawa and that city's still paralyzed? And there are, sort of random efforts to stop other pieces of critical infrastructure. What happens then? At that point, do you have to roll in the armed forces? So what happens if this is ineffective? We're told this is the biggest card in the deck. What happens if it doesn't work?
Yeah, well, it's a big question, but I still think they had their best day of the protests yesterday, the federal government, because they had something to say for the first time, and for the first time any government really had anything to say about what's going on in Ottawa. I mean, going back to how they found themselves in this position, I'm assuming they got caught off guard by the Ottawa protests. They expected the other levels of government to deal with it, particularly the Ottawa police force. And by the time they realized that they were looking weak, they were looking weak. And they've actually had a terrible couple of weeks. I mean, the polling would indicate that as opinion has hardened against the protesters in Canada, it's also hardened against Trudeau personally. Yeah. And which is an interesting dynamic, given that he allegedly represents the anti-protesters. But last week was just awful. I couldn't believe what they were doing last week with the talk of process and putting ministers out there to issue bland talking points that didn't say anything and talking about process. Yesterday was way better, especially the Freeland part. I thought it was interesting that the Prime Minister gave Freeland the meat of the announcement to make. And yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting play. I mean, there's so much involved in this, in terms of what Trudeau's calculations must have been about this. And part of it is, I assume, he's so determined not to be his dad. So determined not to be his dad. And so any notion of anything like the War Measures Act or putting a tank or a soldier in the streets of Ottawa was way a bridge too far. And maybe that's good sense. But as you say, we're counting now on the money to drive these people out. But the consequence of this is that the Liberals have taken a hit, and Trudeau has taken another hit on this, and I think a pretty substantial one. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that really strongly, and I do think that days and days and days of having not much to say. I mean, the Prime Minister's presence was intermittent and repetitive. So he would say, this is wrong. And he would say, we're making every resource available to local and provincial governments as they require them. And that's it. There were no talking points. There were no action items. There's no specificity. So there's nothing you could hang your hat on. And I'm not surprised that we saw the phenomenon you're talking about in terms of public attitudes. And I think there's a third leg on the stool. So the one is, attitudes are hardening against the protesters. They see these people acting ridiculously. They see that they're acting unlawfully. And so if you're inclined to be negatively biased against them, then that's hardened. But then you also see the federal government failing to act to correct it. And I think that, and so I'm not surprised that attitudes have hardened. It kind of reflects the scuttlebutt I hear from people. I would hear people in the same sentence say, get those fucking guys out of there. What in hell is going on? Hot tubs and sound stages? Fucking bust that shit up and get those guys out of there. And then they would take a sip of their beer, and the very same people would say, and what the hell is with Trudeau anyway? Jesus Christ. And so you kind of, like, you could see those things swirling. I think the third leg of that stool is that everybody is frustrated. Everybody does want mandates to end and, the ability to move around freely to return. But, not everybody is assured that, that the process to that ought to be guided by people that are blaring air horns in downtown Ottawa, as opposed to what some medical officer says, actually now there doesn't appear to be another variant and you and your kids are going to be safe. And so I think even as people were making announcements and stuff, and I want to talk about Ford in a minute, I think it kind of hardened attitudes on both ends, because I think as people were like, I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated too. I'm not a protester. I'm not an occupier, but I'm frustrated too. And I don't think that helped Trudeau much.
How long do you think they sat around in Ottawa and told themselves it wasn't their jurisdiction before they realized that in the public domain it had become their jurisdiction?
I've thought about this a lot. Haven't you? Like I've thought a lot about what was going on in Langevin. I've imagined sitting at those shitty tables they have on the second floor and those half-assed carpeted doors, and just sort of looking around at each other and people saying, "Look, you know what? Overwhelming." I think the answer to your question is 5 days. That's what I think. I think about 5 days they were saying, you know what? This is the police chief appears to be rolling around and can't get the flames stamped out. The mayor's on the firing line. People are wondering where Ford is. Prime Minister, got to be very careful. People are going to think about the War Measures Act. They're going to think about your dad. All we do is say that we're here as a resource and we're providing support. Don't get yourself in this. Don't own this. And that sounds like it's good strategic political advice, but like we've talked about it before, but when people come to the conclusion that the institutions of law and order, the institutions of the rule of law, the institutions of government aren't there to protect their interests and seem to be powerless in the face of just some crazy sons of bitches who were screaming that they want to replace the government and they want freedom and they're going to listen to
but it's the
Molly
capital.
Hatchet.
It's the capital. Like when Washington is under attack, people don't say, "Where's Marion Barry?" or whoever the hell the current mayor of Washington is. They go, "Where's the government of the United States?"
So I think after day 5, they were saying, you know what, we have to play some cards here. And I think it highlights maybe, and I'd be interested to see, I haven't seen people write about this, but I'd be interested in this. I thought it kind of highlights a big gap, which is the federal government, it sort of has a 0 to 60 problem. Like, it can offer, every possible support, hearts and prayers and access to RCMP intelligence, or it can bring in the Emergencies Act. It's kind of like, it felt to me that for like 8 days, they were struggling because they were trying to use words to cover that gap, and it was obviously failing.
Do you remember Marion Barry, by the way? The mayor of Washington?
No blow, no hookers, just good government.
Just good government. That's right.
That was the comeback trail. After he'd been arrested in a hotel room with hookers and blow.
Well, anyway, having watched all this occur, I'm pretty sure the Ukrainians are feeling less bad about the fact that we're not sending over troops to help them fight.
Well, but we are offering them every available resource and access to RCMP intelligence. Blah, 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 I guess. I don't know.
Before the other day, all we were offering them was $8 million in non-lethal weapons. What are $8 million of non-lethal weapons? Dull knives? Like, what is this?
No kidding.
Guns that don't shoot?
It's an awful lot of money to spend on spray cans. Go away, Russia!
All right. How many hurly-burlyites' eyes glaze over when you're exposed to the minutiae of corporate balance sheets and investment reporting? Yeah, I'm with you. But despite its unsexiness, it is meaningful and often really telling stuff. Like this not-so-insignificant factoid. Telus employees are Telus's fourth largest shareholder group, with full voting rights. So what does this mean in real life? Plenty. First of all, many of us have seen how some companies control all voting shares and shut shareholders out of decision-making, including team members. They keep it all pretty tight and in the family, don't they? Telus team members, however, have a real voice in decision-making. Let me underline that. Because they're owners with voting rights, they are major contributors to how the company moves forward with its social purpose. For example, Telus is a leader in rural connectivity and all the benefits that brings, in part because team members often come from, live in, and care deeply about the success of their rural communities. Healthcare access and innovation, technologies that dramatically improve both our farming practices and our food chain, the ability to access education and do business from anywhere. On top of that, in 2021 alone, Telus's giving included $90 million in charitable giving, representing more than 5% of Telus's pre-tax profit, and 1.3 million hours of volunteer work. Telus also contributed over $1.6 million to emergency response efforts in 2021, not to mention supporting thousands of low-income Canadians to get connected on low-cost, high-speed internet and wireless programs. All of that, and there's more than I've been able to briefly mention, is driven by the Telus team, which wouldn't be possible if they didn't have a seat at the table. Their passion might not be line listed on the balance sheet or in a fourth quarter results report, but it's in there, it's felt there, and it's what makes Telus the collective success that it is. So you wanted to talk about Ford. Let's talk about Ford. First of all, I tweeted yesterday, why has the guy not been to Ottawa? It's insane that the guy's not been to Ottawa to show support for the people of the city, to rally the troops, and to stare down the goddamn protesters himself. He's that tough guy. Until the Ambassador Bridge, he was as disengaged as Trudeau. I love the fact that the Ambassador Bridge got action so much faster than Ottawa.
You 800,000 people in Ottawa can twist on the fucking barbecue for all we care, but you shut down trade for 13 hours, and boy, oh boy, watch government snap to attention, huh?
Totally. Fuck with democracy, and there's good people on both sides. Fuck with money, and the jackboot of the authority comes right down on you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, so he still doesn't care about Ottawa, but he has been carving out what I think is interesting about what he's been doing politically, is that he has been maintaining what would be a traditional conservative approach to law and order, as opposed to the populist approach to law and order that is being carved out by the federal caucus. There's a very stark distinction between the way Ford talks about these protests and the way Pierre Poilievre talks about these protests.
For sure. And if Jenni was still here, she'd reach through the Zoom and feed my testicles to me for what I'm about to say. And she'd make fun of me because I'm going down my Doug road here. I actually think Doug Ford's had a really good week. And maybe that's a relative statement, but he had
a good last week. He schooled the feds last week with that statement. Problem is, nothing's happened since that statement.
Well, I actually think I'm not sure I agree. I think yesterday was a very clever day politically, and in terms of political positioning, I thought that being the most prominent premier to embrace and welcome the Emergencies Act, so that he could be coherent with the statement that he had provided before, so that he could be coherent with the position he's taken on the Ambassador Bridge. Leave aside, as you say, his absolute missing in action presence with respect to Ottawa. But he positioned himself so he can say, look, I've been coherent and consistent on that. But even as all that news is moving out, just the machinations, the operations, the political communications of the day, he announces that he's going to remove vaccine mandates. And I find that frustrating. Like, I find there's a bunch of things I don't necessarily like about it. I don't like that it can be characterized. It can be at least seized upon by protesters and lunatics as evidence that that their efforts have succeeded. And I don't think we should be feeding the crazy. I think we should be starving them. But so there's a bunch of stuff I don't like. I also think it ought to be guided by, medical advice, and public health advice, not political calculation. Nevertheless, when I'm just being a cold-eyed political operative, I think that he's kind of managed to thread the needle and given himself a good position, because he can argue, look, I'm trying to relieve that pressure that certain parts of his voter coalition feel very strenuously about. So he can say, I've got something for you. Also, by the way, relieving a bit of pressure from the small business community, from all of us that feel so frustrated, and, but at the same time, maintain his position as saying, look, we're not going to have any trucker trade with these protesters and occupiers. So I actually think that he's managed to navigate this, and he's the biggest bull in any China shop, but he's actually managed to navigate it, I think, with some skill, and he's kind of put himself in a not bad position. Now, tomorrow will come, and the day after that, and this thing is a dynamic event politically, but I thought that he had a really good day yesterday, actually.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I've just been amazed since his statement last week at what happened in Ottawa. Like, so they managed the Ambassador Bridge, it seems, pretty well. But Ottawa just continues to amaze me. So the premier goes out and declares a state of emergency. He denounces the truckers in the strongest possible terms, and threatens all kinds of tough and stiff action. And then over the course of the weekend, the protesters are bringing in DJs, sound systems, big screens. They're setting up hot tubs and saunas. They're continuing to get gas to their cars. I mean, I have some serious questions here, Scott, about whether the levers are connected to power, and whether, is there an issue about whether the police are under civilian control right now?
Well, it's an interesting question. I'd like to hear more from the Ottawa Police Service. Like, what's occurring there? I presume and I hope that there have been instructions that I would find head scratching. So I assume and hope that the command structure hasn't fallen apart, and that police officers are being instructed that because of the size of them versus the size of those, that they're not to interfere with the establishment of that soundstage. As fucked in the head as that seems to me. I mean, Jesus Christ, they can throw the Grammys after 14 or 16 days. Anyway, whatever. It just makes me bananas. Don't you? One of the things that drives me crazy about this whole event is I find myself in the uncomfortable position of being what I think a 50-year-old dad in the late 60s in the United States watching campus riots must have felt like. Like, I find myself, get the fucking nightsticks and water cannons and clear out, right? I feel like, and so I find myself in this weird position of, banging and saying, I want law and order. I'm like, what, am I a Nixon Republican all of a sudden? How the fuck did this happen? But anyway.
No, I talked to some 60s radicals yesterday who were basically calling for Jim Watson to turn into Mayor Richard Daley and fucking send in the stormtroopers.
It's kind of a weird place. But anyway, going back to it, I assume that the police are acting under instruction as opposed to it being kind of some sort of weird work to rule sympathy. We've got the high profile incident of the OPP officer saying, "Hey man, we're right behind you. You know, keep on trucking." I like to think that that's an anomaly, not an example. You worry that there's. I mean, sorry. Last thing. No matter
well, the
what,
boys, the cops will not engage with them. I don't know if they're afraid to engage with them, or they don't want to engage with them, or they agree with them, but they're not engaging with them. 3 weeks from now, when all this is over, if I fucking go into Wellington Street and start setting up a hot tub, what is going to happen to me, Scott?
Well, it depends. It seems that if you bring 3,000 friends with you, sweet fuck all. I mean, isn't that the lesson? And that's what's so that's what's so concerning about this, right? Is that it appears as though if the police fail in their first move on the chessboard, then they can't ever sort of get back on top of the game, right? Because once they permitted, like big news.
There's no excuse at this point, Scott, for not having enough bodies.
I don't maybe
in the first week you can say we don't have enough bodies, but by fucking now, that's not a reason.
Exactly. Like if there's 4,000 of them, like we've got planes and vans and trains, can't you bring 7,000 uniforms in and go, all right, we're going to stand 10 feet from you. Now 6 feet. Now 2 feet. Now get the fuck out. Or you're handcuffed. I don't understand why that hasn't happened. And I know that, I guess, when it does happen, there will be violence to a certain degree. But there may not be also. I mean, we saw, the Windsor police, they look like they had a very specific tactical plan, right? They moved in. They kind of accordion. They moved in, then they moved back. They moved in, they moved back. And then they said to them, and I wonder if they were just kind of demonstrating their force. And then it was like, okay, you guys are going to lose your vehicle permit. You're going to lose your insurance. You're going to lose your way of life. And some of you may bump your head on the way into the fucking cop car. Okay, so time to go. And they're like, you know what? I think we're going to leave. I don't understand why that can't happen in Ottawa.
Okay. As we are all pretty much aware, these are dyspeptic times in Canada. There is unrest, to put it mildly. For months, we've had to deal with failures in the foreign supply chains we've perhaps unwisely come to depend on so heavily. It's a big reason for spiking inflation, as we've explored on this pod recently. That's costing us all a lot of money. And we've now learned how quickly and easily our vital North American supply chains can be disrupted. The very term supply chains has in fact gone from being economist jargon to the phrase of the year. It's anxiety producing. I guess that's the best way to put it. But our sponsor, CN, wants to point out a few things that may be of some comfort. First, the large veins and arteries of our economy are the railroads. Without trains that load and roll and unload on time, commerce and manufacturing would collapse. Grain would sit uncollected in silos, containers would pile up in seaports, minerals and fuels and engine parts and furniture and a startlingly long list of other basic needs would stop arriving. If you think car dealers have low inventory now, I can assure you they'd have nothing but empty pavement in their lots if trains were interrupted. But CN's trains have not been interrupted. They've reliably kept trade alive throughout the pandemic. Yes, in these days of deep cold and heavy snow and ice, safety considerations sometimes force railways to shorten trains and slow them down. There's no way around that. Safety comes first always. But to be clear, CN's trains are rolling. From the Gulf of Mexico up to the Great Lakes and from coast to coast in Canada. They are moving our economy day and night. I've said it here before. You might not see CN's trains very often. They roll through forests and across prairies and over mountains, usually far from public sight. But they are performing a critical public service, and CN is grateful every day for the conscientiousness and tireless hard work of its railroaders. So there's two other governments that have sort of stuck their head up through this process, and that's Kenny and Mo out in the prairies. And Kenny's been a little nuanced. He's had the big problem at Coots, which he's been decrying, but he's sort of I see him as trying to play both sides of that. Mo, both of them rejected the government's declaration of emergency measures, even though it obviously wouldn't have applied in Saskatchewan. Mo still rejected it. I think Mo is becoming a dangerous figure in Canadian politics. I think Mo is becoming a danger to the Federation. He's unassailable electorally and is now relentlessly currying favor with a small separatist element of Saskatchewan. He's doing as much as he can to foment anger at Ottawa, even though he's not in an electoral cycle. He refers on Twitter, on official accounts, and in statements from the government of Saskatchewan to the Trudeau government, not the federal government or the government of Canada. He actually supported the convoy and has made it clear that his withdrawal of vaccine mandates and mask mandates is in a reaction to the protests. So he is overtly stoking some of the worst forces in the Canadian Federation right now. I really, really angry about Scott Moe's very existence.
Yeah, I know you are. Coming from Saskatchewan, I know that it has a particular personal dimension to it. I can't disagree with you. I mean, I think that he is perhaps the at the provincial level is right now the most unfiltered version of what we're seeing out of the federal caucus by and large, and certainly out of the most powerful elements of the federal caucus, led obviously by Poilievre, which has attached itself to this cause, to the cause of populism, to the cause of grievance politics, to the cause of people having their anger, to the cause of feeding people's anger back to them, and all of that, and misinformation and contradiction and all that kind of shit that's a part and parcel of it doesn't matter. And I think there's some ideology, but mostly a lot of political calculation behind that. I think there's been a decision about where the richest vein of votes might be, and I think they got 36% or 35% of people with them. I think that they can make a lot of money out of that, make a lot of loyal voters out of it. But look at the fundamental problem we witnessed in the last 18 days, and this is where we miss Jenny, because this is just you and me kind of viciously agreeing with one another. But if I worked in government for 17 years, right? Like, I'm the worst example of somebody that should be talking about this, because by nature, I am an establishment type of person. Like, I am an institutionalist. I have a lot of confidence in institutions, and I believe in institutions, and I would think they need to be fought for fiercely. But I think the last 18, 19 days is the core issue is on both the protesters and then those who are watching it, worryingly, is either a lack of deference or a lack of confidence in our institutions and the rule of law and the ability of political leaders to turn words into action and protect your interests. And when you get political leaders who feed the cynicism and feed the mistrust of institutions, the very fucking institutions that they themselves seek to lead, you get a problem. And the reason that Kenny is more contradictory and more nuanced, as you say, is that he boomerangs back and forth between having to be the premier of Alberta and is freighted with the obligation to protect the healthcare system and respect the public interest, with his political impulse, which is to protect his right flank and feed this river of populist bullshit. And right now, because they're opposition, you see those federal voices, there's no compunction, no apology, no stepping back. Like, one thing you won't get from Pierre Poilievre is any of that indifference or indecision that you got out of Aaron O'Toole. He says, I'm with the protesters. Even as they put up a sound stage and dance naked in the streets and say they want to replace the government. If he was the fucking government, would he feel the same way? So it's troubling. Yeah.
It is. But it's really, I just don't. I do wish Jenny was here for this conversation, although it would probably be difficult. I just don't know where the Poilievre strategy takes them in terms of public opinion. But, the real risk is not that Poilievre is onto something that's super hot and that he's going to galvanize mass numbers of Canadians. The scary thing is that the only thing I know for sure about Canadian politics is that the Liberal Party is going to lose an election in the next 2 or 3, at the latest. And so, who's ever in that chair, you can say you're not going to lose to. You can say you can't lose to Pierre Poilievre. You can say you can't lose to Doug Ford. You can say you can't lose to Joe Clark. You can tell yourself anything you want, but when it's time to lose, you lose. And so Pierre Poilievre, despite the fact that he's offside significantly, I think, with most Canadians, could end up the prime minister still.
No question. I think he's a monumental threat to be successful. Right. And again, I mean, Jenni isn't here, but I think he is a genuine and monumental threat to be successful, because I think that he'll unquestionably galvanize whatever that number is, whatever that number of, 30, 32, 27. I don't know where it's going to boil out at the end of the day. And I don't know if these events increase that number or decrease that number overall. But he's going to galvanize all of that. And then all he needs on top of that is a differing issue set where, people are focused on economics, not on this law and order stuff. So the vulnerabilities are somewhat diminished. He's able to take the same populist language, anti-elite language, run it right at the electorate, and people can poo-poo and say, oh, that's not a fair analysis of actually what's happening at the Bank of Canada, but we don't know that it won't have traction that goes beyond that base that we just described. And then you got a couple of missteps and some fatigue with the incumbent, and the next thing you know, the guy wins. The ingredients necessary for success are not that great, and he leads a great institution in the Conservative Party that has a lot of equity, and he is a talented political communicator and politician. So he's not going to have any of the feckless problems that we saw that anchored down O'Toole. Yeah. But then there's the other side of the equation, David, right? And this is where, I find myself, in order to beat this guy and beat back this kind of politics, you got to be as good as you can be on the other side. So you need to decide how you're going to fight that. Telling people
this government needs a shot of adrenaline. This government needs a shot of fucking adrenaline. You know what it needs? It needs to start thinking that better's always possible again. I don't get any sense of excitement about the future anymore from the government. They're really bogged down, really hunkered down.
I like that a lot. Look past Polyev. Look past Polyev and say, I'm painting a picture of something we're going to be able to do that's beyond that. And don't just say, well, we're going to sign whatever, the 15th child care agreement. It's got to be a more, not necessarily activist, but more active agenda. And obviously, I think they've got to protect themselves on the economic front more vigorously than they are. But beyond that, there is an attitude. One of the threats is that this is going to be a gigantic culture. This is going to be culture war politics. I think all things being equal, what the lesson of the last couple of weeks and the rise of Polyev tells us that we are almost inevitably headed for a culture war election in Canada. And the Liberal Party and Justin Trudeau need to figure out precisely how to fight and triumph in that kind of battle. Because I'm pretty convinced it can't be telling people they're stupid. I'm not one of those that says, oh, this is all the fault of, Trudeau because he called them the lunatic fringe and stuff. But you can't tell people who are watching in the middle that if they agree with any aspect of what they're hearing, that they are dumb and stupid. You can't be the superior, smug, elitist that people say you are. You can't be what your opponents say you are. You got to be better than what your opponents say you are. And this government needs to sharpen its message, decide how to best fight this kind of bear, and set some fucking traps. And don't wait till Polyev wins the leadership. Start setting those things now.
All right, let's go to our clipping of the day. Woo. John Ivison wrote in the National Post the following. Is there room in the Canadian political marketplace for a new centrist party that rejects the tribalism being embraced by the Liberals and Conservatives? I'm increasingly of the mind that there is. Centrist voters at the next election will have the choice between a tired, illiberal Trudeau government, clumsily persisting on its ideological crusade to impose equity, and a populist Conservative party that seems destined to subordinate science and reason in its attacks on elitism and privilege. Nearly 6 out of 10 Canadians in a Maru public opinion poll last year said they felt politically homeless, and that number has surely risen as the non-affiliated tire of the relentless chauvinism. Is there any hope for a party that appropriates the best of the Liberal and Conservative parties? Do you have an answer for Mr. Ivison, Scott?
Yeah, the answer is no, and there shouldn't be. Before we go any further, let me just say this about John Ivison, because I want to say something. We've known each other a long time. Sometimes I agree with him. Mostly I disagree with what he writes. But I do want to say, just on a personal level, I don't know if you noticed, David, but he's recently been in Scotland, his homeland, and his mother's aging, and they had to sell the family home and move out of the family home. That was pretty moving watching that. So if he's a listener, I hope he knows we're thinking of him. I was touched by all that. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. I think that is that's confusing observation for analysis. I think that the reality is that parties, especially the large brokerage parties that we have, they respond to the political spectrum. So if there's a reason, if you're concerned about the Liberal parties, it feels like it's gone too left of center under Trudeau. Well, it did that for a reason. It did that because it learned in 2015 that it had to move to the other side of the NDP in order to take those voters. And it's learned that it needs to continue to feed those voters in order to stay in power. I do think it needs to consider how to best broaden its brokerage appeal and include more voters in it, because I don't think 32 is a satisfactory number. I think you got to be 40, and you got to play for that game, particularly if you're the Liberal Party. And similarly, I think the Conservatives feel like they're less and less of a brokerage party, and they've decided to dedicate themselves to a different kind of political project of populism. And, it's got a whole set of current social media for fundraising and for political activation sort of techniques to it. But I still think at the end of the day, like this idea that you could form like Red Tory Inc. and it would sit in the middle and it would take Paul Martin Liberals. I hate it when people tell me that. Hey, you Paul Martin Liberals. I'll take the Paul Martin Liberals and the Claude Wagner Tories, and you'll end up with a big success. I don't think that's the parties in our system respond to the electorate. And oughta. And so if you lose, then you'll discover that you probably shrank yourself. And if you win, then you're probably on the right side of growing. So I don't think we need a new political party. I just think we need both these political parties are going to have to be sharp in the way that they respond to current events.
Well, I have some sympathy for his analysis. For his observation, because I do think that both parties have largely moved away from their historic centrist brokerage party role to become more ideological parties. And I think that's frankly to the detriment of the country. I think it's a country with so many divisions in it that it benefits from brokerage rather than from polarization. But, my observation about political systems around Canada and around the world is that when the centrist party disappears, it's very difficult to reinsert a centrist option. Once politics polarizes, there is no Liberal Party in England. There is no Liberal Party in Saskatchewan. There is no, and I was deathly afraid, obviously after 2011, but I was also afraid in 1984 when it was 40-30 in the House of Commons. So, I think that even if he wants that to happen, and even if theoretically there are the votes there, it's really difficult to reinsert into this a centrist option that would gather sort of 40% of the vote from either side. I just don't see it happening. My hope for what Iveson is talking about is that both parties come to their senses. Exactly. That the Conservative Party seems determined to pursue this course that they're on, and I hope it gold waters them. And out of the ashes comes a more sensible option for them again. And I hope the Liberal Party, probably under its next leader, it would have to be, uses its position in power to try to broaden its support base rather than to get into a how motivated can we make a smaller base of people. Let's reach out to a larger group of people. There's polling out now that says that the 51% of Canadians would consider voting for the Liberal Party, which is considerably more than would consider voting for the Conservative Party. But back in the 90s, that number was 60% of Canadians that would consider a vote for the Liberal Party. So our pool has definitely shrunk.
I agree with all that. Let me say one, just picking up on what you said, I'll add one thought, which is a terrifying thought, because it feels like the risk inherent to it is so grave. If you want, my view, parties tend to expand their voter pool and tend to stretch themselves, become bigger after a failure. that it forces a rethink, that it forces a retrenchment, usually forces new leadership and all of those things. And I think it's actually easier for the Liberal Party because of its inherent characteristics. Doesn't purport to be ideological. It doesn't really have too many ideological elements to it, provided it doesn't decide that it wants to. It may be easier for the Liberal Party to occupy a larger space on the spectrum if it chooses to than the Conservatives, who are a little bit more encumbered with some hardcore ideological elements that create challenges in terms of its growth. But the problem is it's hard to do that. So unless the Prime Minister is energized and takes that dose of adrenaline and says, I see a massive threat here in Pierre Poilievre and the politics that are represented. And that animates and energizes me. And it's going to cause me to not just try to motivate my existing voters, but to grow those voters and to fight this thing and to put on a brand new shield and sword. Then the scary thing is that the most likely opportunity for this change to occur is after the Liberal Party fails and it's forced to rethink its voter coalition and leadership. And I hope that doesn't happen because I think the consequences of losing to Poilievre would be fairly serious for politics.
Yeah, it'd be a tough 4 years for sure. All right, Scott, I think we've reached the time for our Hayus.
Okay.
Mr. Pinsent, would you please assemble the accursed?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hayus are about to begin.
All right. My Hayu goes out to Chrystia Freeland. Chrystia, thumbs up. You're the first person to come to this protest with a plan. It looks like a robust plan. You looked strong yesterday. You looked like you thought it through. I liked it all a lot. And now do it. Be the first person to execute on a plan in this protest and make this thing happen. Starve these people of money and get them out of there. And you had the first good day for the federal government yesterday since these protests have started. And let's make sure it was real. Scott, you got a Hayu?
Well, it's interesting. My Hayu is in the same neighborhood, but quite different from yours. My Hayu is to Chrystia Freeland, Marco Mendicino, and Bill Blair. I think that's probably maybe the Justice Minister, David Lametti. I think that's the constellation of ministers that would be affected or might have a hand on this particular plow. I'm glad about what you did yesterday, particularly the Emergencies Act measures with respect to financing. I think that it is the most tangible, most concrete measure that's been taken. I think they will have good consequences in the near term and probably in the long term, because choking off the funding, particularly from foreign sources, for this kind of extremism and organized subterfuge, I think makes perfect sense. But my hey you to all of you is not that I think you've done a great job and I'm wondrously happy about the plan. My hey you is a warning, right? Don't give us a McDonald commission. Don't overreach. Don't permit these powers to be abused. Don't start raiding bank accounts of people that you don't like, or permit others to raid bank accounts of people you don't like and choke off sources of funding that can be conflated into political opponents. Don't let that happen. We do not want that. This thing is for 30 days. Step very careful. If you're going to target someone's bank account and river of financing, you make certain that that river is blood red. Do not for 1 second overreach, because the consequences will be severe and they will really, really, really taint everything that's happened. And the motives will be retconned, and it will be combustible. Don't overreach. This is an immense amount of power that you've given yourself to fuck around with people's bank accounts. Use it with great, great care.
You know, Scott, if I thought they were going to use these powers to go after their political enemies, I'd be a lot less enthusiastic about them.
I don't think that's what happened. That's not even what I'm saying. First of all, we don't have any money, David. They can't come after us. But that's, I just think that, shit happens, as the McDonald Commission showed us. Like, shit happens when too much latitude is granted. And so I think it's got to be really heavily scrutinized. I'm going to break the rules. I got one other hey you.
Yeah, double hey you.
Double hey you. Hey, Jenny, come on, change your decision, all right? Like, you got two old white guys here talking about the McDonald Commission.
You mentioned Claude Wagner. That was the obscure reference. Okay. That was the obscure reference of the day.
It's the sound of podcasts not being downloaded across the country. Help us. We need Jenni back now.
We do miss Jenni, but I want to assure our listeners and viewers that it will not be the two of us alone here next week, that there will be a third person to be named later on the box, and it will be exciting. It won't be Jenni, but it will be exciting. So, thank you to Telus, our presenting sponsor. Thank you to CN Rail, and thank you to all you accursed. Thanks, Scott, for doing this with me today, and thanks, Jenni, for your years of service to this pod, and we look forward to having you back as soon as we can. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next week.
From Peter, Paul, and Mary to just Peter and Paul. Man.